Thank you very much for coming. I'm very excited to have you here, and special thank you to Matt, who has accepted today to share a little bit about his experience. Matt Friedman is an international trafficking human expert with over 30 years of experience in this area. He's been part of USA, then worked for the United Nations, and currently he's the CEO of the Mekong Club, which is an association of Asian businesses that have come together to fight human trafficking. So we're gonna be doing a talk. At the beginning, Matt will make a presentation. In the meantime, you're welcome to comment and start chatting using the chat. Obviously, Matt won't be able to keep up with those comments, but the audience can engage in the meantime that way. And then once we are done with the presentation, we'll have a bit of Q&A and discussion. So it doesn't only need to be one directional with the speaker answering questions from the audience, but it can be multilateral with everyone bringing a little bit of their experiences. So again, thank you all very much for coming and joining this RnDAO event. If you're not familiar about us, we're a research and development organization. We do research in DAOs, specifically DAO operations and governance, and as well, we incubate DAO tooling. So thanks again, Matt, over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm going to be talking about human trafficking, modern slavery, but with an emphasis on the private sector. What I like about this group is you guys have some amazing background, and in fact, you're doing things that are really new to me. So as you listen to this talk, I hope you'll just think about, if this was your problem, how would you apply it to your world? And we can talk about that at the end. To begin with, I'm going to start with kind of what most people think about when they think about human trafficking, which is the picture in the top left-hand corner, forced prostitution. For good reason, there are 4.8 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was about 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal for USAID. I was a public health officer, and my job was basically to take resources and to translate them into healthier people. At that time, we found girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. We couldn't understand what was going on. So we went to go and interview them. And we heard pretty much the same story over and over again. And it went something like this. Human trafficker, a guy around 20 years old, would go into a village and flash a bunch of money around. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then go and say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife. I want a rural wife, a village wife. He'd find a girl, 12, 13 years old, go to the family, say he'd like to marry them. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. Everyone is like really excited about this. A couple of days later, they actually have a wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. Afterwards, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district. Now, this girl's never been 20 kilometers away from her home. So when she's in India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw all these women milling around wearing funny clothes. She says, no, don't leave me. I'm scared. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again, maybe 30, 40 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happens. When many of these girls internalize what's going on, they say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then takes the photograph of the wedding and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists And over a 2-day period of time, they'll rape this 12-year-old girl maybe 20 or 30 times until she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line, which means that she will be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she's so burnt out spiritually, emotionally, and physically that nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. Many of them languish in India and die of AIDS. Some of them make it back. And these were the people who I was seeing. But I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. Had a police officer with me. Went into one of the brothels and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this foreign Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and I said, we need to get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. He said that if we try to leave, they'll kill us both. To make a long story short, we both left. We came back with more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell the story because every once in a while in life, we are tested. That was my big test. I failed miserably. After that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. So I did what a lot of activists eventually do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo, you have a fishing boat in Thailand. The story behind this is a Cambodian boy, 15 years old, is told by his family, you got to go to Thailand and get a job. We're poor, you need to send money back. He goes to Thailand, he's looking for work, not finding it. Finally, a human trafficker in that area sees him, goes up to him and says, hey, brother, you're from Cambodia, I'm from Cambodia. Looks like you need some help. Let me lend you some money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat's going to go out for a couple of months. You'll catch a bunch of fish. You'll come back. You'll have money in your pocket. Life is going to be good. He goes down to the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 16, 17, 18, 19 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. They give him strong drugs to stimulate his body to work. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in, guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. We own the police. This is another example of human trafficking. Bottom left-hand corner, I lived and worked in Thailand. I was working for the United Nations. And one of the things that we came in contact were seafood packing companies that were sweatshops. The story behind this is a person would go down to a place called Sumit Sakan. They have a lot of these seafood packing places there. He'd knock on the door and the manager would come out and say, what do you need? I'm looking for a job. Manager say, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of around $50 US a month. But if you do this, you have to stay in the factory. You can't leave. This guy's never made more than $25 US. He's thrilled. He goes into the factory, works under these horrific conditions. But at least in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I can send money home. After a couple of months, he goes and asks for his pay. The guy says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. It costs $54 US for you to live here with food and board and everything. I'm only paying you $50. So guess what? You owe me money. You can't leave until you pay it back. So every one of these people are working in a situation where every day they work, they get deeper and deeper in debt. They're never able to buy their way out of debt. Some of these people had worked there 4, 5, 6 years without having a single day off, no hopes, no dreams, no aspirations for anything. You can imagine what kind of life that person will have. Another form of human trafficking. So in this talk, I often use human trafficking and modern slavery interchangeably. There's a difference, and let me explain what the difference is. So human trafficking 30 years ago, when they were looking for a terminology, was mostly people going from one country to another and then ending up in an exploitative situation. And so because they were crossing borders, they said, well, this is like drug trafficking, where you take drugs from one place to another and sell it, or arms trafficking, where you take arms from one place to another and sell it. In this particular case, it's human beings. So the movement was considered relevant. But then over time, people said, well, wait a minute, whether a person goes from one country to another, or from one district within the same country to another district, or from one side of a city to another, if they end up in an exploitative situation, shouldn't you focus on the exploitation, not the movement? So when they were looking for a terminology that explained when a person doesn't get paid, they can't leave, there's violence, there's threats, there's debt, the closest word they had was slavery. But when most people think about slavery, they think about something that happened a long time ago, so they put the word modern next to it. So modern slavery is basically the endpoint of the process of human trafficking. That kind of puts it into perspective. When it comes to the number of people who are associated with this, it's about 40 million. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. This is worth stating. According to the UN, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. Where I am in Asia, there's about 62% of them for two reasons, basically. Number one, there's a lot of people in Asia. China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.27 billion. Then you have Pakistan and Bangladesh and Japan and Philippines. They all have huge populations. The second thing is the feudal systems, the systems that were in place for generations that exploited people have never been completely dismantled. As a result of that, you still see exploitation taking place the way it did generations ago. When it comes to COVID, the number of people that's estimated to be in human trafficking will probably go from 40 million to 60 million. And the reason for this is desperation. So let's say that you were a woman working in Bangladesh in a garment factory, and you had a fairly good job and you could live off the paycheck and you were supporting 4, 5, 6 people, but all of a sudden COVID hits and the contracts end and the transportation stops and the product can't go from one place to another. So they keep sending you home saying, well, you don't have any work, go home. This goes on for months and months and months. A lot of these people have no savings. The only way they're going to survive is if they borrow money. The moment you borrow money, eventually you have to pay it back with high interest. There's no means of paying this back. And so the money lenders come and say, well, if you can't pay it back, I need a family member. They're going to end up in a brothel or on a fishing boat in a sweatshop. They're going to be there for years to pay you back, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why we think that this is going to go up significantly over time. The rate of exploitation is the number of people who enter in different timeframes. About 9.2 million people enter per year in a single day. 25,200 people enter into modern slavery somewhere in the world. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 1,000 who are new slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering into a slave-like situation. It could be in Thailand or China, or Australia, United States, the UK, somewhere in the world that's happening. When it comes to the age distribution, about a quarter of the cases are children, the rest are adults. Most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution. It only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest of the cases are forced labor cases. And as it relates to us as human beings, 60% of those cases are associated with supply chains, where we get our electronics and our clothes and our shoes and our food and our fish. So as consumers, we buy things, and a certain percentage of what we buy is tainted by modern slavery. So kind of like the global warming issue, when they keep saying as consumers of electricity and power and so forth, we are polluting, we have to be part of the solution. Because we're supporting modern slavery indirectly, we also have to be a part of the solution. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So when it comes to who's supposed to address this, well, it's supposed to be governments, but most governments don't really like this topic. The government of Japan and Hong Kong and China and Thailand and Australia and Singapore don't really like to admit the fact that they have slaves. They do things to try to address it, but usually not enough to really make much of a difference. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system, I do. But I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels, eating really good food, talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what I was supposed to do and what I was actually doing. So the groups that are really doing most of the work are the non-government organizations. They're the ones that go and do the raids and the rescues and pull the girls out and put them in shelters and do the remediation work and the rehabilitation work, et cetera, et cetera. But when we go back to the numbers again, out of 40 million people, 75% in forced labor, 60% of them associated with supply chains, There's another group that has to be involved in helping to address this, the private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody wagging a finger and saying, it's because of your greed, your desire for shareholder profits that you would willingly use slaves in a private sector situation. Now, the reality is that most major companies would do anything and everything to avoid any kind of exploitation because it's a danger to them. But most people think that the private sector is inherently involved. In many cases, legitimate businesses are not, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the report card. Out of 40 million people, I'm going to show you how many people were rescued out of modern slavery, out of all the government and NGO and United Nations organizations combined. So think in your mind what a good number would be. And then out of 500,000 criminals, how many of them were actually put in jail? And here are the statistics. Out of 40 million people, about 100,000 people were helped last year, which is 0.2% of the victims, not even 0.5%. When it comes to the 500,000 criminals, about 9,000 of them were put in jail, which is about 0.8%. Now, when you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Are they not doing their job? That's not the issue. The issue is this. The profits generated from modern slavery are excessive, $150 billion a year, second only to drug trafficking, which is about 300 billion. So this is the second largest transnational crime in the world. The amount of money that is available to address this is about 350 million US, which is 0.23% of the profits. So the profits are excessive and extreme, and the amount of money available to fight it is tiny and insignificant. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that's available to fight human trafficking, the 350 million. You can see what it is that we're up against. The second thing is the scale of the issue. There's about 20,000 people like me that work on this full time against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations and laws and procedures and get approval from donors. Every time anyone gets close to them, all they do is mutate and change, and so they have an unfair advantage. And lastly, general awareness. Most people don't know about this issue. And usually when I'm in front of a group and I can see everybody, I say, how many of you knew 25% of what I was talking about before I said it? Usually I get one or two hands, but not many. So if you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care about it. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So awareness is essential. And it's not really your fault. The counter-trafficking world hasn't done a good enough job of raising awareness, and that's why we do these kind of talks. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to the private sector. What I've been talking about up until about 10 years ago was very much an NGO, UN type thing. Those were the people who were focusing on this. But now it's in the lap of private sector. And the reason for this comes back to that number 0.2%. When governments and regulators came to realize that a small percentage of people were being helped by the NGOs in that this particular topic was associated with supply chains, they said, we need to bring the business world in. But because they felt like the only way to get the business world involved was to create a business risk or a pressure, many of the trends that we see focus on that. So I'll go through them very quickly. The first trend that we see is legislation. So prior to 2012, what happened is the businesses and the United Nations and the governments would come together to talk about human trafficking, talk about human rights, and they come up with guidelines and principles. The famous one is the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights. There's a lot of conventions that came. Most of this documentation was excellent. It really describes what businesses should do, but it was never binding. The first legislation started in California about 10 years ago. It's called the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. And what it basically says is that if you're a company that has products in California and you have profits of $100 million in either retail or manufacturing, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance. You just have to say something. This allows consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. The second act that came a couple of years later was the UK Modern Slavery Act. It went from 100 million and lowered it to 36 million pounds, but it added a few other things. An annual report that you have to say what you're doing annually related to this, and it has to be signed by your board of directors. Then the French had an act and the Australians had an act, and we're seeing acts in Germany and Canada. What we're seeing associated with these acts, though, is with each incarnation of these acts, they add new things. The German legislation, basically, if you're a manufacturer and you cheat people and you have modern slavery, you get fined. And so that's something that we see associated with that. Another thing we're seeing is major lawsuits against companies. So let's say that Tesco or Costco or Walmart wanted to buy seafood from Thailand. These lawsuits would go after them, basically saying, because you are buying these products, you're supporting these slaves. In one case, they actually wanted on the side of the tuna fish for there to be a label that says this product could be tainted by modern slavery. Not a very good thing for that company. The chocolate industry gets sued on a regular basis because the cocoa beans come out of Africa, often in forced labor circumstances. A lot of kids are associated with it. Lawsuits against companies create reputational risk, naming and shaming, and it hurts businesses. So you can see why companies want to understand this. We're seeing a significant increase in media coverage associated with this, almost a doubling every year for the past 5 years. Now, in the 1990s, just about every week you would see articles about HIV/AIDS, and for about 10 years that was the case. When was the last time you heard an article or saw an article related to that topic? Not for a long time, because that era ended, and then the global warming movement came in for 15 years. Now the new movement, the new developmental topic is modern slavery, and expect to see more and more kind of coverage on this, more interest in this, more articles on this, and as a result of this, you're going to see more people having an appetite for this type of content. ESG. Now, ESG is the metric that is used by big corporations to determine how they are interacting with the social aspects, the environmental aspects, and the governance aspects. So ESG is a voluntary set of indicators. And if you fill this out and you have good scores, the investors are going to come to you and want to invest in you because they think you're solvent and you're a company with purpose. What we're seeing is that the S, which includes modern slavery, has been kind of almost ignored, but it's now beginning to pick up. And so eventually what you're going to see is a lot of these indicators will focus on modern slavery. So this is another reason why companies have to focus on this. Why? Because a lot of millennial investors care about this. According to one study, 84% of them. These same millennials will be eventually managing the big investment funds. And because they care about this, they're going to put emphasis on this. And that's why we anticipate we're going to see much more of that over time. So let's talk a little bit about supply chains. The supply chains are basically where things are made, the manufacturing side of things. And so the typical supply chain has 3 tiers. Let's say this is a running shoe. Tier 1 is where the running shoe is assembled. They get all the parts and they just sit there and they make that. That tier has been audited for probably 35 years. You generally don't find a problem at that particular level. But the other tier, where you have the shoelaces and the rivets and the zippers and the textiles and the sole of the shoe, nobody's ever looked at that. And below that is the raw material, the metal, the copper, the wool, the cotton. So what the legislation says is that you have to look at all of these different layers. Now, let's say that you're a company and you've been auditing 1,400 factories at tier 1, and all of a sudden you have to do tier 2 and 3. You can imagine the issue that they have. How are you going to do this? Who's going to pay for this? Are you going to have to transfer the cost over to the product? So there's a lot of confusion related to what's going to happen associated with this. So what it is that we have here are audits that often go into these factories. And I'll just give you a couple of the types of things that the auditors are looking at that are considered to be indicators of modern slavery. So let me use a Nepal example. So there's a guy in Nepal, he makes about $30 US a month. And it's not enough really to survive in a village level. So a recruitment agency guy comes up to him and says, hey, how would you like to go to Malaysia and make $250 a month? And so you can really make tremendous amounts of money. Your family would benefit, everyone would benefit. Guy says, that sounds great. What do I have to do? Well, you need to come with me to Kathmandu. We'll train you. We'll get all your documentation. We're going to send you to Malaysia. Oh, by the way, you also have to give me 1,500 US dollars. Guy says, I'm poor. I don't have $1,500. They say, don't worry about it. We'll lend it to you. Just sign this agreement. So he signs the agreement, not knowing that there's all kinds of fees and horrible interest and everything. By the time he gets to Kathmandu and eventually to Malaysia, $1,500 is $3,000. So when he gets there, he ends up spending literally years trying to pay back the debt he has before he makes any money. That's called debt bondage. That's an indicator of modern slavery. Another thing that happens is that he signs a contract in Nepal and he reads it, he knows what it says, but when he gets to Malaysia, they give him another contract in a different language. He looks at it and he says, I can't sign this. I don't know what it says. They say, you have to sign it. I can't, you sign it, you're going to lose everything. So he signs this, not realizing that the contract cheats him. It charges him for room and board and penalizes him if he doesn't meet quotas and everything else. So he's really not making $250. He's only making $120, which means it'll take even longer to pay that debt back. The other thing that happens is his documents are taken. So let's say after 6 months, he says, I want to go home. I can't take this. I hate this job. The guy says, well, you agreed to 3 years. You're not going to be able to get home. I'm not going to give you back your passport. Guy says, I'm going to go to the police. Company says, go ahead. We're going to say we never had it. You're going to be put in a remand center. You're going to go to jail. You'll be sent home. You'll never get another passport again. So you can see how these things are basically used in order to hold a person in place. So what companies are doing is they're developing policies that basically say they have zero tolerance related to human trafficking. These are the big fashion brands and the big banks and the big manufacturers of anything. They're training everyone within the company. I do a lot of training, not only within the brand, but also within the factories and the sub-factories and the sub-factories in languages so that workers know what their rights are. They're doing audits that go deeper into ensuring that none of those employees have any kind of debt, because the big brands don't allow factories to have any indebtedness within that factory because it becomes a risk for them. So responsible recruitment basically says a big brand like H&M or Zara would go to a factory and say, do you have any of those employees that have any indebtedness? If you do, we can't work with you. If they have debt, you have to pay it back. That reduces the vulnerability. And last, there are all kinds of grievance apps and hotlines to allow employees basically to give feedback based on what it is that is going on in the factory. Let me talk a little bit about some of the banks. So people would say, why would banks be concerned about this? Well, basically 150 billion US dollars is generated from modern slavery. If any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. And that particular bank basically gets fined. Westpac Bank in Australia was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars. That resulted in the chairperson being sacked, a bunch of employees being sacked. It had a devastating impact on the business. And so as a result of this, a lot of banks are doing everything they can to ensure that no dirty money makes into the bank. So what do? Well, basically, there are 3 different approaches. One is a typology. What they do is develop this scenario that looks at the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim along a path. And then they look at the transactions that take place to determine if any of those transactions could be perceived as negative or related to modern slavery. They then take that information and they do what's called forensic accounting, which means that basically kind of look at how the money is being spent to see if there's any issues or problems, and then they apply that to big data. So let me just walk through these. This is an example of a typology. You can see the various steps where the people is recruited and then they go from one place to another, and then they end up in the final location. This is a sex trafficking link. On the bottom, you see the transactions that take place. This is what the bank's looking for. And a certain number of those transactions could be potentially dangerous for the bank. They are red flag indicators. So to give an example of forensic accounting, there was a nail salon chain in the West Coast of the United States. and it was run by Vietnamese people. And the hours were from 9 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. But an accountant, an auditor, found that there were transactions taking place at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all around $200. When they looked into it, they came to realize that there was a sex trafficking ring in that same business. So the red flag indicators would be transactions after hours around $200 in a particular type of business. And so if you take that pattern and you apply it to your data, you can then determine whether or not you have an issue or problem related to modern slavery. So that's basically kind of what the banks do. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what my organization does. I'm the CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. We work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery, to protect them. So we work with the manufacturers, we work with the hospitality sector, we work with the banks, with the retailers, with the tech world, with the construction world, anyone and everyone who has a potential risk. Now, we came up with this name because the organizations that we were working with said, you can't have human rights or human trafficking in the name because it's a risk for us to engage with companies that do that or have that in their name. So call it something that means nothing. So the Mekong River goes through Southeast Asia. So we called it Mekong, we called it Club. It's just a very gentle way of describing what we do. So I mentioned kind of what the banks do and the retailers and the manufacturers. Let me just talk a little bit about the hospitality sector. The hospitality sector, where you have your hotels, they have 4 vulnerabilities. They have construction, which could be fraught with modern slavery. They have sex trafficking. And in the United States, hotels are being sued if a victim is identified as being in a hotel. So it's a business risk there. They buy seafood and linen and furniture, which could be tainted by modern slavery. And they also have migrants that often come in and do service jobs and so forth. So that vulnerability is there for hotels. The first thing we do with companies is an assessment. We sit down with them and identify where they are in their journey to have systems and procedures in place. And then based on their limitations, we'll help to fix it. We also give them training, we give them tools, we give them apps, we give them dashboards, we have e-learning that we have in multiple languages that allow for us to train C-suites and directors and workers at all different levels so that they understand what the issue is. And as a result of that, we are able to ensure that the private sector is safe. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is going to switch gears a little bit and just end with a couple of stories related to modern slavery. And the first one kind of encapsulates my feelings on kind of what I think the world needs to do related to this particular topic. So going back to my Nepal days, about 30 years ago, I desperately wanted to do something to help address the issue of modern slavery. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of that process, I went from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to give my story. But as I did my interview, she sat and listened to all of them. When I finished and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So she sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture and disease and betrayal and murder. I honestly didn't know what to say to her. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things that they did to you. She paused and paused. Then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said that she went to school until she was 12. She knew that everything that was around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said, they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for not caring enough to allow a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times, only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. Now, I tell this story because Gita pretty much called us all out. She recognized that the 20,000 people like me are not enough, that everybody needs to care about this. So I often say to my audiences, if I could get everyone to do at least one thing a year, whether it's 100 people or 1,000 people or 100,000 people or 1 million people, that would add up if we had numbers. So people often ask, well, what is it that we can do? Well, one thing you can do is learn about this. Well, guess what? You just learned about this. You've done your one thing, you're done. But imagine if you tell 2 other people or 3 other people, you've done another thing and another thing and another thing. How easy was that? Another thing you can do is to be a responsible consumer. Before you buy something that's branded, go online to see whether or not the company has a policy. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, say, listen, I like your products. I'd feel better if you have it. You don't have to be antagonistic. You can be very polite about it, but companies react to this. You can volunteer. Many of the people that work with us, we have about 70 volunteers, are private sector people, they're bankers, they're communications people, marketing people, tech people, and they do it because they want to give something back. Actually, my youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary and she approached me and said, okay, I saw you there. I see this is a terrible thing. What can I do to help? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So I asked her what it is that she felt like she could do. She said, I can find anything on the internet. So I gave her a chance. And basically, she was able to find within 2 days things that my second-year Yale law student interns couldn't find, because that was her God-given gift. That was what she was good at. So if you apply what you're good at to helping, that's like a win-win for volunteerism. You can donate or fundraise. A lot of the organizations like mine, during COVID, we lost our funding. The funding was diverted to other things. It dried up. And so giving a small donation, even $25 to a shelter in Cambodia can keep somebody in a shelter for 3 or 4 weeks. Small contributions can make a big deal. So the last thing I'll just kind of mention is I'll mention a private sector story. And, a lot of people think that the private sector are inherently evil when it comes to this, but I think they're actually heroic. So I was in Washington, D.C. I finished a conference at the American Banking Association. And then this guy comes up and says, I want to tell you a story. I hear this all the time. And I said, yeah, go ahead. Tell me your story. So he said he was driving across the United States. He had his wife, teenage daughter, and they got about halfway to where they were going, and they pulled into a motel. He got his wife and daughter settled. He then went out to get some food. As he was leaving, he saw this 14-year-old girl being dragged into a motel room. He thought it was related to prostitution. He was very concerned. He had a teenage daughter. So he went to the office and reported this. He didn't know if anything was going to happen. But sure enough, 15 minutes later, the police came. 15 minutes after that, this guy was being taken out in handcuffs. The girl was being taken away by some women in an unmarked car, presumably to a shelter. He said, that was a milestone in my life. I felt so proud of myself that I helped this person. I just wanted to tell you that. So I looked at this guy and I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, I'm a banker. And I said, I get that. You're at a banking conference, but what do you do within banking? He says, basically, I do for anti-fraud and I do anti-money laundering, and I basically try to protect the bank and so forth. I asked him if he ever did cases related to modern slavery. He said, yeah, all the time. I said, dude, don't you realize that you've been doing this work all the time? You were heroic. It's just like that case that you saw. You just don't see the front end of this. But by you identifying these trends and these nefarious activities and sending the suspicious transaction reports to the regulators, you were contributing to ending modern slavery. This guy was shocked. He said, well, I never really thought of it that way. You're absolutely right. So I was in Singapore, and basically, I was in front of a bunch of bankers at the Singapore Banking Association. And I told this story and about how heroic you guys are for, using your banking systems and procedures for addressing this issue. And afterwards, I must have had about 20 bankers come up to me and say, wow, nobody ever gives us a pat on the back. So by them doing their job, they prevent drug trafficking and corruption and fraud and human trafficking. And it's the same with the auditors. The auditors, I saw Chinese factories 30 years ago. They were terrible. But because of audits being done every year, they get better and better and better. So many of the improvements have happened as a result of the private sector. So just so you know, I have a couple of books out that we sell them and the proceeds go to charity. One of them is Be the Hero, Be the Change. It's a book on volunteerism. The other one is a book that profiles my 30 years of addressing modern slavery. If you're interested, they're available on Amazon. With that, I'm done. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt, for such an enlightening talk. Also a punch in the gut, and I think appreciated, let's say. Also fascinating perspective. I was thinking throughout on a couple of points, and by the way, everyone, I'll pass on to you for a second. In a second, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat or use the reactions button in the lower part. You can raise your hand like this, and that way I know that you have a question, and I'll pass it on to you. And then in the meantime, as I was saying, I had a couple of thoughts. One of them was around recruitment fees, and this is partially a parody, but also maybe something to think about is how in DAOs, especially related to NFTs, one of the patterns that we're talking about is the having to buy the token or having to buy the NFT before you can participate into the club. And I guess it's fine if you're dealing with a bunch of wealthy people who can afford to do so, but if you expand this pattern to those in the fringes, to those who might struggle to do that, you might end up in situations where you're actually putting people, well, outside of labor or forcing them into a debt that they might not be able to pay. And that I found that quite interesting. I'm going to have to think more about that and think about the implications and what kind of things could be done related to it. The other thing that that got me to think about, I'm not a developer working in an industry that is very much tech driven. And when you're talking about the contracts in another language, it sounds almost funny. Like we have smart contracts, which are all code, and I cannot really read them as an example, even though I'm someone who works in this space. Now I'm lucky to have many people who can audit a contract for me as a favor if I need to. But we are also in that situation where I guess being able to offer translations and ensuring that as a default becomes really important and gives me a little bit of food for thought. Then to perhaps to start with the questions, and again, if everyone has a question or a comment or something you'd like to add, it doesn't necessarily need to be a question, but to feel free to put it in the chat or to open up with the raising your hand in the reactions. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the trafficker perspective, because if I'm thinking about it, like having an employee work for 4 years and then having to find a new person is a cost. Like you have to get someone new, you have to train them. I guess these are very basic jobs, so the training is minimal, but you still have to replace them. And we're talking about a very sophisticated, complex operation to acquire people. And there will be jobs that like no one maybe will ever do, like being systematically raped. I imagine we won't find any volunteers and so on, but maybe in the fishing boats. And I get that there are extreme conditions, but so I'm curious about these sort of short-termist extraction perspective, like let's try to extract as much value out of this person and then destroy them, versus the maybe longer perspective, or what other sort of dynamics other than these people just being bad could we think about?
Well, it's just basically based on greed. You know, they realize that they can get free labor just by forcing people to work. And so the fishing boat situation is pretty simple, because you're captive on the boat. You can't leave. And if the captain has a gun, and many of them do, and a first mate who basically goes and enforces everything, they just create such fear in those people that they're going to get as much work as they can. If the person gets sick or injured, or the captain doesn't like him, they throw him off. And then when the boats that come in to basically take the catch away and to give supplies, they always have a couple of these slaves on them. They just buy another one. And so, you know, you're really talking about 4 years of free labor. So, and again, the training on the boat, within 2 days, you know what it is that you have to do. It's pretty easy and straightforward. So there's not much of a capital loss in a sense based on that.
Unfortunate. Sandy, please.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's very easy to replace people. So I'm Sandy Scalani. I'm actually working in the anti-trafficking world. I have been for the last 20 years in Florida. I'm currently the director of Voices for Florida, which is Florida's largest network providers for services to child and youth sex trafficking victims. And ironically, I'm also in a PhD program and researching DAOs and DAO governance. So that's what brought me to this room. Thank you for your work. I'm really interested in how it intersects with this group in particular. And some of the research that I've been doing is really forward-thinking uses of blockchain for supply chain transparency, for example. If we're thinking about kind of how we can utilize the skills of the DAO community, of the blockchain developers and things like that, I would be really looking at how we can use that to ensure and transparency with that supply chain, but then also how do you, it can be on blockchain, you can have the contracts and all of that, but if it's not relatable to the general public, if it's not usable by the general public, then it's kind of useless. But there are some use cases right now with the supply chain transparency with blockchain, which is great. Another thing that's interesting is the money laundering using crypto has been a really big deal as far as just kind of resistance towards crypto adoption in general by governments. And a lot of that is because of that money laundering factor, and that traffickers can very easily launder their money. So I work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security and FBI and all of those people in the multidisciplinary teams. So, they obviously have a very conflicted relationship and perspective of that. So how do we develop the decentralized space and crypto space to be able to ensure that people aren't being exploited and facilitating exploitation through using these technologies at the same time as maintaining the integrity of the technology itself, the anonymity and all of those reasons why people really want to use this space. So it's definitely an interesting topic to bring to the decentralized world and kind of pick apart. But I'm here with you guys in Discord, and if I can remember to check my 4,000 messages, but I'm here. I'm in the RnDAO. So hi, nice to meet you guys.
What you described, there are all kinds of interesting tech things that us folks in the counter-trafficking world are new to. I didn't know what an NFT was until recently, and 6 months later, I'm working with them, and we're doing a fair amount of work in exploring the human rights and human trafficking in the metaverse, because we see through social networking the recruitment and the grooming and all the other things that are taking place in the existing ones, and the metaverse has the potential for that. So, what we've done is we've in the past brought a bunch of people who have a particular topic, where maybe it's a tech or an app building or software or that type of thing, to do a hackathon, to just have us present to them, these are our problems. And then they come back and say, well, in our world, this is what we would do in order to address it. And those are the types of things that I think offer the opportunity for us as counter-trafficking people in a more traditional world to evolve and to change and adapt and perhaps come up with solutions that go beyond what we're exposed to. So I didn't know what a DAO was until today, and now I know. And by next week, I'll be pretty versed on it, because I'll read 30 articles on it and watch a bunch of DAO for Dummies, and until I get to a point where I understand it, because I kind of get where you're coming from with blockchain, the foundation of it, and how you have the community and everybody has to vote and everything. I just never really applied anything like that to any of my work, but I'm sure there's an application out there for something like this.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the privacy really comes at the crux of it. And we've been with one of the projects in RnDAO related to community health analytics. So this is a lot more for community managers to figure out whether their community is healthy or not, as in people are happy and so on and engaged. But one of the most complex questions that I think is very pivotal for the space is the privacy one, as in we have on one side, one pattern where we can create a lot of transparency, and that can tremendous benefits in that it is auditable, everyone kind of knows what's going on and so on. But then when we kind of come from an unsafe world perspective, or like start to think about the dangers, is anyone could use that data to target the specific individuals and certain things. And it's interesting to think of the counter pattern, or the other side of that coin, that is also with the privacy, is you protect the individuals both for good and for bad. And these things seem like, again, the way we design these systems around privacy just seems to be just stuck in the middle. And I don't know, like in the room, there is a bunch of people. I don't know if you folks have any inklings at answers or things like that. But when I start to think about human trafficking, that's one situation I can see, well, I have some influence over that question, and I have absolutely no clue how to address it from a privacy perspective, at least when we have to make decisions and trade-offs. If I want to take these into consideration, I don't even know where to start. Yeah. Other than perhaps veering more towards transparency, but I don't know if that's a good answer either.
Mm-hmm. Something really interesting, Daniel, I also just wrote something on the self-sovereign identification, and there's so many unidentified people in this world who are also then incredibly vulnerable to being trafficked. And so if we're using blockchain to have control over our own identity and what information we share with people, that could also, I think, be something interesting to work on that could help with this issue.
Thanks for sharing. I'll think about that. Then I guess it's, well, also can't remember who was saying, but about the usability of those systems, so we can get it to the fringes, to these marginalized communities and so on, right?
Mm-hmm. And think about how Ukrainian refugees were using, DAOs and crypto in order to be able to leave Ukraine and survive. And, that is an incredibly vulnerable situation as well, when you're displaced from your home. So there's tons of potential in blockchain technology in general to reduce vulnerabilities for people. It's just about how to make that usable and mainstream and protect people from being exploited in the same app.
Thank you very much. We have space for one or two more comments. If there is anyone else who would like to bring something to the topic, your questions, your observations, your perspective, it would be very much appreciated.
No, I guess I'll just put one. Oh, go ahead.
No, go, Daniel, please.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. No. So yeah. Just a thought. I know the past few months, a lot of people have talked about, like soul-bound tokens and like tagging, and like one thing I've kind of been into as well is having like various basically like rating systems and metrics. So one thing that I think could be useful in this space too is like organizations and like DAOs, or not just DAOs, but just independent entities, or whatever these entities look like. Basically, curating like certain standards and applying them to different either companies. Like we talked about, like certain companies have have this arm of their research where they make sure that or their company where they make sure that they're compliant with anti-human trafficking standards. So if there's like these organizations that develop that basically assign these rating systems and tagging, like they could basically like blacklist certain addresses that are suspected of human trafficking or something like that, and that could be like automated too, to make sure that those addresses don't interact with like different protocols and stuff like that. And there could be sort of like alliances between contracts and organizations and stuff like that to ensure that they're not taking any liquidity that is from these sort of addresses. But yeah, just like a thought.
Yeah, one of the things that the banks are doing here in Asia is they're looking at the call girl websites, the selling of sex and so forth, and they're taking the data and comparing phone numbers to see whether or not you see commonalities in phone numbers and names and various other information to see if there's patterns. And what we're seeing is that out of Russia and Israeli and Colombia, you see that there are certain links with sex trafficking rings here in Asia where women and girls are kind of moved from city to city, and you can see the patterns by just taking the big data, analyzing it, and then visualizing what the patterns are, and that helps to then link that to other businesses that could be associated with that. Now, once again, the banks are doing this because they're trying to protect themselves from having any association with nefarious organizations that could potentially be contributing to the possibility of money laundering for them.
Interesting.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to make one final one?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't avoid thinking about the parallel between some of the situations that Matthew described and the default way that most DAOs engage with contributors, which is bounty boards, where there's a bunch of things that DAOs say that people can do, and there's all these bounties, and then the contributors need to apply for doing the bounty, and then doing the work, and then presenting the work, and then delivering the work, and then only maybe get paid, right? And so it's a situation where the contributor is a bit in a power imbalance, right? And there's even some exploration, some ideas where some DAOs that have these bounty boards are trying to ask for a deposit from the contributor so that he fulfills on the promise of delivering the work, and then when the contributor delivers the work, he gets his deposit back and the payment, right? And that seems exploitative a bit, as in the same way where the guy from Nepal gets recruited to Malaysia and then goes on a fishing boat and then gets that and so on, right? So I couldn't avoid doing the parallel between those practices of bounty boards and bounty hunting and that usually go on in DAOs and some of these stories. And I think we should reevaluate the whole bounty system in DAOs and not make it the default system, for sure.
I just want to thank you for that comment, because we also don't know who's behind the people that are actually doing the work. I mean, you can have a factory out there where somebody has recruited 20 people to do the bounty work.
Yeah, exactly. There's probably bounty farmers that are doing real world modern slavery practices to fill up an office full of computers with people doing tasks for DAOs and getting paid.
Yeah, just one more thing that I want to add that is a new type of trafficking that Sandy and others maybe have not heard about, which is happening here in Southeast Asia, where young people are being, 20-year-old college kids are being lured to Thailand on either kind of a love interest type situation or the promise of a good job, only to be picked up in a van and then taken to Cambodia, where they're basically forced into a facility where they scam people for 14, 15 hours a day. And if they don't, they get beaten and tortured, killed. If they just are not very effective at it, they'll sell the person back to the family in Hong Kong and Taiwan and so forth. But these scam facilities are popping up all over. We see one in Nepal, we see it in Dubai, we're seeing it in Kenya. And it's a new phenomenon because what they're doing is just kind of grabbing people off the street who look like they may have some English or computer skills so they can scam the UK and the United States. And it's a new phenomenon. We've never seen anything like this before, but it's happening in the thousands of people. And, the governments here in this part of the world are stepping up and getting involved in it. It's just a crazy new incarnation of human trafficking.
There's actually a famous YouTuber that is called Scammer Payback or something like that, where he acts this kind of scammers to try to prevent them from scamming people, and they get in touch with the victims first, and they prevent people from being scammed live. and it's kind of like a real-time cat and mouse kind of thing. Like the scammers are saying, go please deposit the money in this place, and the scammer prevention people are like, don't do that. And it's amazing.
Kind of like white hat scamming.
Yeah.
That's a super interesting idea, actually, to prevent it in DAOs, like spam people with our own scam message and then tell them, by the way, this is a white hat scam. You could have been scammed for real. Don't do this again. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for attending. Thank you very much, Matt, for the presentation, and everyone as well, especially Sandy, for also bringing all your insights and questions and comments on this topic. For anyone interested, I share the link to RnDAO. We can also continue the conversation there or on Twitter, and look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you all.